I didn't think much of the assignment when it first came through. Work in Antarctica sounds dramatic when people talk about it. But after a few rotations, it becomes work like anything else. It's remote, it's freezing, and every task takes longer than it should. But most of the time, the job itself is pretty straightforward. You go in, do what you came to do, and come back with data that matters to someone sitting comfortably in an office thousands of kilometers away. This one was supposed to be the same. I joined the team a few days after they had already set up at the inland site. The transport flight took me to the coastal base first, and from there I was moved inland by tracked vehicle along with supplies and equipment. That trip always feels longer than it probably is. After a while, the landscape stops changing altogether. Everything looks the same in every direction, and your sense of distance starts to fall apart. The drivers rely on instruments because your eyes stop being much use. By the time I reached the site, I already had that familiar feeling you get out there. The isolation is one thing, but it's more than that. After a while, the rest of the world starts to feel far away in a way that's hard to describe. You know it's still there, but it doesn't feel connected to where you are. The drilling camp was small. A few temporary structures, reinforced panels, equipment rigs anchored into the ice, storage units, and a narrow perimeter marked with poles. It was functional, built to do a job, and nothing more. Nobody was trying to make it comfortable. We weren't there to stay. Harris met me outside when I arrived. He was leading the site. The first thing I noticed about him was how steady he seemed. He spoke the same way the whole time I knew him, calm and measured, like he understood that once people start sounding uncertain in a place like that, things can go wrong very quickly. He gave me a quick rundown, introduced me to the rest of the team, and walked me through the setup like he had done it 100 times before. Lena handled communications with the main base. She stayed near the relay unit most of the time, monitoring signals and logging transmissions. Becker was responsible for ground scans and subsurface mapping. He had a habit of explaining what he was doing out loud, partly for himself and partly for the rest of us. O'Neill worked the drilling rig and knew the machinery better than anyone there. Ruiz tracked weather and environmental conditions, which mattered more than anything else once you got that far inland. And Harris kept all of it moving without needing to say much. I slotted in where I was needed. My part was mostly ice core work. It's repetitive work, but it has to be precise. Depth, pressure, extraction timing, contamination control. Small mistakes can ruin a sample completely. Most of my first day was spent getting familiar with the equipment, checking calibration, and reviewing the data they had already collected before I arrived. Everything looked normal. The ice layers showed exactly what we expected to see. Long-term accumulation, gradual compression, consistent density changes, clear historical separation between layers. It all looked clean. Exactly the sort of structure we had come there to study. The only thing Becker mentioned, and he said it almost casually, was that one of the deeper scans from the previous day had shown a slight inconsistency. Nothing major, just a variation that didn't fully match the surrounding layers. He had already adjusted for it and reran the scan, and the second result came back clean. He didn't seem worried, but the fact that he mentioned it at all told me it had stayed in his head. That afternoon we ran more scans to confirm the next drilling points. Becker set up the equipment while the rest of us moved between tasks, checking readings, logging positions, and matching everything against the base data we'd been given. It felt routine, the kind of work that settles everyone into a rhythm. Then Becker called us over. He didn't raise his voice. He just kept staring at the display for a second longer than usual and said, "Come have a look at this." The scan showed a vertical section beneath the surface. The upper layers were fine. Normal density, normal structure, nothing out of place. Then further down, the pattern broke. The density reading dropped sharply in one narrow section and opened into a gap. The shape was too clean to ignore. It didn't look like a natural fracture. The edges were too defined for that. Becker adjusted the scan angle and ran it again. Same result. Ruiz stepped in beside him, checked the depth markers, and compared them against the regional data. After a few seconds, he said, "That doesn't line up with anything we've got mapped here." Harris stood there, watching the screen without saying anything. He was the sort of person who never rushed to fill a silence. After a few moments, he told Becker to run a full sweep. So Becker widened the scan area and ran multiple passes from slightly different positions. Every one of them showed the same thing. A vertical void, deeper than we expected, with boundaries that didn't match the surrounding structure of the ice. It didn't look like a crack or a pressure pocket. It looked like open space. I asked Ruiz what the temperature looked like at that depth. He checked again and said it was slightly warmer than it should have been. Not enough to explain anything by itself, but enough to stand out once we were already looking at an anomaly. Becker asked if it could be some kind of thermal pocket. Ruiz said maybe, though he didn't sound convinced. We marked the coordinates and logged the readings. Lena sent the data back to the coastal base along with our observations. After that, there wasn't much else to do except wait for instructions. The wind started building as the afternoon wore on. You could hear it dragging across the surface in long, low currents, pushing fine ice across the ground in thin, shifting sheets. Visibility was still clear, but the weather had started to change. You could feel it coming before you could really see it. We moved inside the shelter while the data was being reviewed. The talk stayed practical. Equipment checks, timing, next steps. Nobody spent much time guessing. Out there, people tend to stick to what they know until the facts force them to do otherwise. The response from base came through later than expected. Lena read it out while we gathered around the console. They wanted confirmation, additional scans, and depth verification. So, we sent everything again. The next response came back much faster. Proceed with drilling at marked location. That was the whole message. They didn't add much else. No extra discussion, no request to hold off, just a direct instruction to keep going. Becker looked at Harris after hearing it, probably expecting at least a short discussion. Harris didn't react right away. He stepped outside for a moment and stood there looking across the ice. I don't know what he was thinking about. Maybe he just wanted a minute to weigh it properly. When he came back in, his decision was already made. "We drill," he said. And that was that. That evening, I stepped outside for a few minutes before turning in. The wind had settled into something steadier by then. The sky was clear, and the horizon had that strange, empty look Antarctica always has, where everything seems flat and endless at the same time. I stayed out there longer than I meant to. I remember looking out toward the distance and thinking the place felt different than it had earlier. I didn't see anything. It was more the feeling that came after finding that void under the ice. Once we knew it was there, the whole site felt different. The ground under us didn't feel as simple as it had that morning. It felt like there was more beneath it than there should have been. I went back inside after that. No one else mentioned anything unusual. The next morning, we began setting up the drill at the marked location. And that was where everything started to change. We started early the next morning, as soon as Ruiz said the weather would hold long enough for us to get some proper work done. In Antarctica, that's usually how the day goes. You work around the weather, not the clock. If you get a decent window, you use it. If you don't, the whole operation slows down. With that new scan point waiting, nobody wanted to waste a full day. The flagged location looked like every other part of the surface. If Becker hadn't marked it, you could have walked right over it and never thought twice. That was the strange part. We knew something was different below us, but standing there was nothing to see. Just ice, flat ground, same as everywhere else. O'Neill started putting the rig together while the rest of us moved around him. First, the stabilizers went in, then the support frame was leveled and locked into place. Every part of that setup had to be right before drilling started. If the rig sat even slightly off, the problem only got worse the deeper you went. It was the kind of work everyone on site already understood, so there wasn't much talking. People just got on with it. By the time we powered everything up, the light had settled into that flat Antarctic brightness you get for most of the day. No real shadows, no depth to anything. just that pale, washed-out light that makes the whole place feel even emptier. The rig stood out because it was the only thing rising off the surface for a long way in any direction. Lena checked in with base and confirmed we were proceeding. They came back quickly and told us to take a sample from that exact point. Harris heard the message, gave a short nod, and O'Neill started the drill. The machine came to life and settled into a steady rhythm as the bit cut into the ice. The first part of the run went the way these things usually do. The drill moved down through dense ice with consistent resistance, and the numbers coming in matched what we were expecting. I was working beside Becker, logging depth and pressure changes as we went. After a while, those numbers become familiar enough that you can tell when something's drifting before it becomes obvious. As we went deeper, the readings started to change. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. No alarms, no sudden jump, nothing like that. The resistance eased a little, and the vibration through the rig felt different. O'Neill noticed it straight away and adjusted the feed rate without anyone having to tell him. The drill kept going, but everyone was paying a bit more attention now. Becker leaned toward the display and watched the density values update. "We're getting close to that drop," he said. Ruiz stepped in beside him and checked the environmental data again. He stood there for a few seconds without saying anything, then said, "Temperature's a bit higher down there. Only a few degrees, but it's holding steady." Harris heard him, but he let the process continue. He was watching the rig more than the screen by then. We passed the depth where the void had shown up on the scan. For a short distance after that, everything still looked stable. Then it changed all at once. The resistance just disappeared. The drill dropped faster than O'Neill meant it to, and the whole rig shuddered with it. He reacted immediately, cut the feed, and hit the brake. The system caught hard. The frame shook, the cable snapped tight, and then everything settled. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. We just listened to the machine winding down and felt the vibration leave the frame. Becker checked the numbers again, moving quickly through the depth calculations. "We went past the boundary," he said. "There's more space down there than we thought." Harris stepped closer and looked down into the opening. From where we were standing, it was just a dark shaft in the ice. Light faded out quickly below the surface, and after a certain point, you couldn't see anything at all. "Send the camera down," he said. O'Neill switched out the drill assembly and attached the camera unit. A few moments later, the feed came up on the monitor as the cable started lowering it into the shaft. At first, all we saw were the inside walls of the borehole. The light from the camera reflected off the ice as it went down, and you could clearly see the layers passing by. Then, the texture started to change. The walls looked rougher lower down, less uniform, less compacted. It wasn't what we had seen in the upper sections. Then the shaft opened into a larger space. The camera dropped free into open air, and the beam reached further out into the dark. The cable swayed slightly as it hung there. At first I thought it was just settling from the movement, but it kept shifting in a way that didn't quite match what was happening above. All of us had moved closer to the screen by then. Nobody was saying much. We were just trying to make sense of what we were looking at. "Rotate it slowly," Harris said. O'Neill turned the camera, and the light moved across the cavity below. The beam caught rough shapes out at the edge of visibility, surfaces that didn't look like the layered ice above. It was hard to tell what we were looking at exactly, but it was enough to make everyone focus harder. The feed stayed steady for a moment. Then a line of static cut across the image and disappeared. After that, the camera angle looked slightly different. Becker looked at O'Neill. "Did you move it?" O'Neill kept his hands where they were. "No." A second later, the cable tightened just enough to straighten. It wasn't a big movement. If nobody had already been staring at it, it probably wouldn't have meant much. But we were all watching it. We all saw it. No one said anything then.
We just kept looking at the line, and after another second or two, it shifted again. Same direction, same small movement. This time it was harder to explain away. Nothing from our end should have been doing that. Harris leaned toward the monitor. "Hold it there." O'Neill kept the controls steady. The camera hung in place with its light pointed out into the space below. Then the cable moved again. Not much, but enough. There was direction to it now, a pull, something deliberate. Something down there had hold of it.
For a few seconds, none of us moved. The camera feed stayed on the screen, pointed out into that space below, while the cable held under a light but steady tension. It wasn't enough to trigger any warning on the system, but it was enough that all of us noticed it. You could see it in the line. It had straightened in a way it hadn't before. Harris kept his eyes on the monitor. "Bring it up slowly," he said. O'Neill eased the controls back and started bringing the camera up. At first it moved normally. Then there was resistance. It wasn't violent and it wasn't jerking around, but there was definitely something holding it back. It felt like whatever was down there hadn't fully let go. "Keep it steady," Harris said. The camera rose a few meters. On the screen, the light moved across the walls of the opening again. We got a better look at the texture this time. It didn't resemble the layered ice we'd seen further up. It looked broken and uneven, but not in the way you'd expect from pressure alone. The cable loosened slightly as it came up, then pulled tight again. O'Neill looked over. "You want me to bring it up faster?" Harris thought for a second, then said, "No, keep it controlled." The line moved again, another few meters. Then it stopped. O'Neill checked the controls straight away. "I didn't stop it. The motor was still running. The cable should have been moving." Becker stepped closer to the rig and watched the line. "Something's holding it." Harris looked from the screen to the hole in the ice and then back again. He didn't rush it. He just watched for a second and said, "Give it a short pull." O'Neill increased the tension. The cable jumped upward a fraction, then snapped tight again, like whatever had hold of it shifted with it. The feed flickered. The picture blurred for a second, then came back. The camera angle had changed sharply. For just a moment, the light caught something close to the lens. A shape crossed the frame too quickly to make sense of, but it was close enough to block the light before it vanished again. Nobody said anything after that. The motor sound changed as the strain increased. "Pull it up," Harris said. This time there was no pause. O'Neill increased power. The cable tightened fully, and the rig started to groan under the load. You could feel the vibration through the frame as the pull transferred through the whole setup. Then, whatever was resisting it gave way. The camera shot upward so fast it hit the inside wall of the shaft before O'Neill got it under control. The feed spun wildly for a second, showing ice, darkness, and then more ice. A moment later, he steadied it and brought it the rest of the way up. Becker stepped forward and caught the unit as it cleared the opening. We all leaned in. The housing was scratched badly. These weren't marks from hitting the ice on the way up. They were thin, uneven lines grouped together in parallel, as if something had raked across the casing more than once. Ruiz looked down into the hole. "That didn't come from the shaft." Nobody argued with him. Harris straightened up and looked around at the site. "Pack it up. We're done here for now." No one needed convincing. O'Neill powered the rig down and the rest of us started securing what we could. We moved quickly, but no one rushed enough to make mistakes. By then, the wind was picking up again, stronger than before, dragging fine ice across the surface and starting to blur the edges of the equipment. Lena sent a short update back to base. She kept it factual. The drop in depth, the size of the cavity, the damage to the camera. Harris did the same when he added to it. Neither of them speculated, which was the right call. Base doesn't want theories in a situation like that. They want facts. The reply came back broken and delayed. We only caught fragments of it through the static. Something about holding position, something about repeating the scan. Then the signal dropped again. Lena tried to reestablish it, but the weather was already interfering too much. Ruiz stepped away for a moment to check the horizon and came back looking more serious than before. "Storm's moving in faster than forecast," he said. "We need to get back." That settled it. We secured the last of what we could carry and left the rest anchored where it was. The opening stayed behind us, a dark cut in the surface that stood out now that we knew where to look. As we headed back toward the station vehicles, the wind kept building. Visibility started to shrink little by little. It wasn't whiteout conditions yet, but it was moving that way. Becker looked back once while we were walking. "Did you see that on the feed?" he asked. Harris didn't answer. We kept going. About halfway back, I felt the ground shift under my boots. At first it was subtle, just a vibration through the ice. Then it came again, stronger, enough that O'Neill stopped walking and looked down. "You feel that?" he said. Before anyone answered, a deep cracking sound rolled across the surface behind us. We turned around. The area around the drill site was collapsing. It didn't split open cleanly. The surface sagged first, then started breaking apart in uneven sections. The markers Becker had set disappeared one by one as the ice dropped into the space below. Within seconds, a large section had given way, leaving a wide opening where the cavity underneath had broken through. The wind carried the noise of shifting ice toward us. Under that, there was something else. Movement. At the edge of the collapse, something came up. At first, I thought it was more ice breaking loose. Then it lifted higher and caught the light differently. A long shape pulled itself up over the edge and braced against the surface before dragging the rest of its body out. Then another came up behind it. Then another. They were big. Bigger than made sense at first glance. And they moved fast, much faster than something that size should have been able to move. They unfolded out of the hole and spread across the ice with this strange, controlled speed, like they already knew exactly how to move in that environment. For a second, all of us just stood there. It took a moment for what we were seeing to register. Harris reacted first. "Go," he said. That was enough. We ran. Behind us, more of them were climbing out of the collapsed section. The wind got worse as we moved, lifting snow across the surface and making it harder to see. One of them closed the distance faster than the others. I heard Becker shout behind me, but I didn't look back. None of us did. At that point, the only thing that mattered was reaching the station. By the time we reached the outer perimeter, the storm was taking hold properly. Visibility had narrowed to almost nothing beyond the structures ahead of us. We got inside and sealed the doors behind us. The wind took over the sound outside almost immediately. For a few seconds, all of us just stood there trying to catch our breath. Then something hit the outer wall. Hard. Metal rang through the structure. Then it happened again. And then again. We got the door sealed just as the storm started closing in around the station. Snow was already lifting off the surface and racing across the ground, and by the time the locks engaged, the drill site had disappeared behind it. The opening, the rig, whatever had climbed out of that collapse, all of it was gone into that white blur outside. For a few seconds, all of us just stood there trying to get air back into our lungs. The wind hammered against the outer shell, and the whole station felt smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. Everyone was still turned halfway toward the door, listening for the next hit from outside, when Lena started looking around the room. At first, I thought she was just checking that everyone had made it in. Then I saw the change in her face. She looked at Harris, then at O'Neill, then at me. "Where's Becker?" she said. Nobody answered. The truth had already reached all of us by then, just not in words. We had run back in a blind panic through wind and blowing snow, and somewhere in those last seconds between the collapse and the station door, Becker had fallen behind. I remembered hearing him shout. I remembered that sudden break in the sound behind us. At the time, I had kept running because everyone else was running, and because the things coming across the ice had been closing the distance too fast for anything else to matter. Lena moved toward the door before anyone could say anything. Harris caught her by the arm and stopped her. "He's out there," she said. Her voice had gone thin and strained in a way I hadn't heard from her before. "We left him out there." Harris kept hold of her. He wasn't rough with her, but he didn't let go either. Outside, something struck the station hard enough to send a metallic shock through the wall beside us. We all felt it through the floor. "If that door opens now," Harris said, "we lose more people." Lena stared at him for a second, and I could see the fight in her face give way to the fact of where we were. She looked toward the door again, then down at the floor, and after that, the tears came. She tried to keep them in at first. Her breathing turned uneven, and she covered her mouth with one hand, but there was no holding it back after that. Ruiz stepped toward her and guided her away from the entrance while Harris moved straight to the console. There wasn't time for anything else. Another impact hit the outer wall, then another. Lena wiped at her face, took a breath that shook on the way in, and pulled herself back toward the comm station because that was her job, and there was nobody else to do it. Harris said nothing about Becker after that. I think he knew if he let the moment open any further, it would take the whole room with it. Instead, he told Lena to bring up the external feeds and get a message ready for base. The camera feeds came through badly at first. The signal was fighting the weather, and the images kept tearing into static before clearing again. Even with that interference, we could see enough to know the creatures had reached the station. The first one came into view near the outer lights, and that was when the scale of it really settled in. Outside at the collapse, everything had happened too fast to understand cleanly. On the monitor, with the station lights catching its body from the side, you could actually see what we were dealing with. It moved low and fast, but when it lifted over uneven ground, the span of its limbs spread so wide that it filled most of the frame. The structure of it was spider-like, but far too large, far too heavy, and wrong in ways I still have trouble describing. It looked built for pressure and cold. Its limbs drove into the ice with a controlled, grounded force that made it seem less like something running and more like something gripping its way forward. It reached the wall and hit it without slowing down. The sound rang through the whole station. Another one appeared from the side, then another from the rear angle. Within seconds, several of them were moving around the structure, striking the walls as they passed, scraping along the exterior panels, circling away, then coming back through the camera view again. The station held. It had been built to survive Antarctic conditions, and that shell absorbed the impacts better than anything lighter would have. But every strike still carried through the floor. You could feel the force of them through your boots and up into your legs. It gave the whole room a low, steady vibration that made it impossible to forget what was outside. I remember O'Neill standing close to the panel, staring at the readings without really blinking. Ruiz had one hand braced against the edge of the console. Lena was back on comms now, tears still on her face, jaw set tight as she worked. Harris stood between the screens and the main room, watching everything at once. One of the creatures moved across the feed and struck the wall again, this time close enough that the camera shook. Ruiz muttered, almost to himself, "How long can that shell take this?" Harris answered without taking his eyes off the monitor. "Long enough, if we do everything right." Then he looked at Lena. "Send it." She keyed the microphone and pushed the message through while the signal still held. "This is Site Delta. We have multiple large unknown organisms at the drill location. They've reached the station. Request immediate assistance." The line broke once, filled with static, and then a voice came back in fragments. Lena sent the message again, shorter this time and more direct. Harris added confirmation about the collapse, the breach under the ice, and the number of organisms we had seen moving across the surface. The reply came through more clearly the second time. Extraction was being prepared, but the storm was slowing movement and limiting approach. Earliest arrival would be 36 to 48 hours. We were told to hold position, remain sheltered, and keep the channel open whenever conditions allowed. Harris leaned toward the console and asked for confirmation that extraction was already en route. The answer came back almost immediately. Confirmed. Then the signal dropped again. Lena let out a breath and sat back for half a second before turning to the next task. The grief was still there on her face, but it had been pushed behind something harder now. She had heard Becker's name inside her own head the same way the rest of us had. and she was carrying it while still doing her work. That felt more painful to watch than if she had simply broken down. Outside, the impacts kept coming. The creatures moved around the station with no obvious pattern. Some of them struck the walls as they passed. Others seemed to run along the perimeter and then angle away again, as if following movement or vibration we couldn't track. One of them slammed into a mounted sensor array and tore it free so easily it looked like the equipment had been made of thin plastic. That camera feed went dark immediately. O'Neill checked the systems panel and said the external sensors were gone, but the station still had stable power. That mattered more than anything else. As long as the shell held and the power stayed on, we had heat, light, sealed doors, and a chance to make the hours ahead survivable. A few seconds later, one of the creatures passed near the rover we had left outside. It never even changed speed. It hit the vehicle, crushed straight through the frame, and kept moving. The rover collapsed under it in one motion, scattering broken metal across the ice. Watching that did more to strip away any illusion of safety than the wall impacts had. The station was holding, but only because it had been built to withstand pressure. Anything lighter than that was nothing to them. Ruiz watched the feed for a while and then said, "They aren't really attacking us. They're just moving through us." Harris gave a small nod. "We're in their path." That was worse in a way. An attack at least gives you intention. It gives you something to argue with. What we were watching on those screens felt more like weather with intelligence behind it, or some ancient migration breaking through a place where people happened to be standing. The storm thickened around the station, and the feeds kept getting worse with it. Every now and then, one of the creatures would reappear in the wash of static and blowing snow, cross the frame in a blur of motion, and vanish again. For long stretches, we could hear them without seeing them, which somehow made the room feel worse. The walls carried their movement in sudden knocks, and low vibrations that always seems to come from a different side than the one you were looking at. Then the sound changed. At first I thought it was just the wind pushing harder over the shell, but after a few seconds it separated itself from the storm. It was deeper than the impacts we'd been hearing, slower and heavier, with a weight behind it that seems to carry through the ice before it reached us. Everyone in the room heard it at the same time. Ruiz turned toward the far monitor. O'Neill looked up from the panel. Lena stopped typing. Harris said, "Find it." Lena switched to one of the remaining outer cameras with partial visibility. At first there was nothing there except blowing snow moving across the lights. Then the storm started behaving differently along the far edge of the frame, bending and parting around something large enough to change the way the snow moved. The smaller creatures near the station reacted before we got a clear look at it. They shifted aside and cleared space along one side of the structure as if they recognized what was coming. That alone told us enough to stay silent. A shape entered the edge of the feed. Then more of it followed. It was far larger than the others. Its body stayed lower to the surface, but the span of its limbs covered so much ground that it seemed to move through the storm in sections rather than as a single animal. Each step carried a weight you could feel through the station floor. The smaller ones had been violent because of their speed. This one felt violent because the landscape itself seemed to make room for it. It crossed the edge of the site and moved straight through the drill area. The damaged rig was still standing where we had left it, half secured and already exposed by the collapse. The larger creature passed over it, and the whole frame folded underneath the weight. Metal twisted, anchors tore free, and part of the assembly vanished into the broken ice beside it. The creature never paused. It never turned toward the station either. That may have been the worst part. All that weight, all that force, and we still weren't important enough for it to notice. It crossed through the perimeter, moved beyond the scattered remains of the equipment, and continued out into the storm as if there were somewhere beyond us it intended to reach.
The smaller ones followed its movement for a short distance. Then most of them drifted in the same direction, spreading away from the station and out into the white after it. Nobody in the room said anything for several seconds. The station was quieter now, but only by comparison. You could still hear movement outside. You could still hear the storm. But the shape that had just passed through the site had changed the scale of everything again.
Ruiz was the one who spoke first. That thing didn't even care we were here. Harris kept watching the monitor where it had disappeared. It was moving past us, he said, towards something else. That line stayed with me. At the time, I didn't know what he meant. I just knew he was right about one thing. We had not been looking at the center of the problem. We had only seen part of it. After that, the activity around the station dropped. Most of the smaller creatures had gone after the larger one, and the impacts against the walls became less frequent. One side of the station went quiet first, then another. A few of the smaller ones stayed close and kept passing near the structure, scraping the outer shell now and then, or hitting a panel hard enough to remind us they were still there. But the relentless circling had thinned out. O'Neill checked the structural readouts again and said the shell was still holding. Heat was stable, power was stable. Internal systems were still intact. Those were the only numbers anyone cared about by then. Harris listened to the walls for a moment, then looked at all of us in turn. "We stay inside," he said. "We keep the systems running. We wait for extraction." No one argued. The storm took over completely after that. It pressed against the station from every side, and somewhere beyond the walls, the creatures that remained kept moving through the dark. Becker was still out there, and everybody in that room knew it. But by then, grief had been pushed into the same place as fear. It stayed with us while we settled into the long wait ahead. Once the larger creature had moved past the station, the impacts outside started thinning out. They didn't stop completely, but they became less frequent, spread further apart, harder to place. Then the storm finished closing in around us, and after that the outside world was mostly gone. The camera feeds broke into static more often than they showed anything useful, and the few shapes that did cross the screens never stayed long enough to tell us much. Inside, everything shifted from reaction to endurance. Harris stayed at the main console, rotating through the remaining feeds even when there was almost nothing to see. Lena kept trying the comms whenever the interference eased enough to risk a transmission. O'Neill shut down what was left of the external systems to preserve power and protect anything that still worked. Ruiz kept tracking the storm, though by then the numbers mattered less than the fact that none of us were going anywhere until it passed. Nobody said Becker's name. That was the part I remember most clearly. He had been with us 1 minute, then he was outside, and after the door sealed, there was nothing anybody could do about it. Lena kept working, but every now and then her eyes would drift toward the entrance before she pulled herself back to the console. None of us tried to say anything to make it better. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't feel useless in a room like that. We stayed in the main section of the station without really discussing it. No one wanted to be off alone somewhere with the walls creaking and the sound outside shifting from one side of the structure to the other. Every so often something brushed or struck the shell hard enough to remind us the area still wasn't clear. Then there would be a long stretch with nothing except wind. That silence was worse in some ways. At least when the creatures hit the walls, you knew where they were. A few hours in, Lena managed to get a cleaner message through to base. "Delta holding position," she said. "Structure intact. External equipment lost. Multiple organisms still believed to be in the area." The reply came back broken, but clear enough. Extraction was staged and waiting on weather. We were told to stay sheltered and keep sending updates when possible. Then the signal dropped again. Harris looked at Lena after the transmission ended and just said, "That's enough." He was right. We already knew help was coming.
What we didn't know was when, and there was no point burning through power or patience chasing a better answer than that. After a while, we settled into a routine because routine was the only thing keeping the room from turning into panic. One person stayed on comms, one watched systems, one rested, then we rotated. Nobody really slept properly. You could close your eyes, but your body never let go of the fact that something might hit the walls again at any moment. At one point, a long scraping sound moved slowly along the outer shell and then faded into the storm. Everyone in the room stopped what they were doing and listened until it passed. Nobody went near the door. Nobody suggested it. We just waited for the next sound and hoped it wouldn't come.
As the hours passed, the movement outside became harder to read. Sometimes a shape crossed one of the monitors. Sometimes a dull impact came through the floor. Then there would be nothing for so long that you started wondering if they had gone, only for some sudden knock against the station to bring all of it back at once. Ruiz said at one point that whatever was left out there seemed to be moving with the storm instead of circling us directly. Harris didn't answer, but I could tell he agreed. Time got strange after that. Without any clear view outside, the hours stopped feeling separate from each other. The station lights never changed. The storm erased the horizon. The clocks told us time was passing, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like we had been sealed into one long stretch of waiting with the same sounds repeating around us. At some point, I drifted off sitting against the wall, and when I opened my eyes, the station felt different. The wind was still there, but it had lost some of its force. Ruiz noticed it a few minutes later and checked the readings again. "It's easing," he said. "Still bad, but better than before." That was the first real change we'd had in hours. Lena brought comms back up and sent another transmission. This time the response came faster. Conditions were improving. Extraction team preparing for approach. Stand by. The mood in the room changed immediately, though nobody relaxed completely. Harris told us to keep waiting. We stayed where we were and watched the monitors as the feeds slowly began to clear. One by one, the screens gave us more of the outside again. The area around the station was empty. The rover was gone, reduced to broken pieces half buried under fresh snow. The drill site looked worse than before. The rig had collapsed into the surface where the larger creature had passed through, and the opening below had widened into a rough, broken gap in the ice. Even partly filled by drift, it was still visible. Seeing it from a distance like that made it feel less like an accident and more like a wound in the ground. Ruiz leaned toward the screen and said quietly, "They moved through here." Harris kept watching the same feed. "They're still moving somewhere." A few minutes later, we heard the engines. At first, it was faint enough that I thought it might be wind moving differently across the station. Then it came again, low and steady, carrying through the last of the storm from somewhere out beyond the white. Lena checked the comms and looked back at Harris. "Extraction team is inbound," she said. That was the first time since sealing the door that the room changed in a real way. Nobody celebrated. Nobody relaxed. But something shifted. Until then, all we had been doing was enduring the hours as they came. Now there was finally something moving toward us. We packed quickly after that. Gear was secured, systems were locked down, and anything we needed to carry was brought close to the entrance. Harris stayed near the door, listening as the sound outside grew louder. The engines were clearer now. More than one aircraft. They were close. Then, through the wall of wind and the low mechanical thrum overhead, another sound started to rise with them. Harris looked toward the door. "Stay ready," he said. Nobody moved. We stood there listening as the aircraft came in over the station, and whatever was still out there moved somewhere beneath them. The firing started before Harris touched the door. It came in short, controlled bursts through the wind, sharp enough to cut through everything else we had been listening to. The sound rolled across the ice around the station and carried through the frame beneath our feet. For a second, none of us moved. We were all trying to work out how close it was and what exactly they were firing at. Ruiz stepped nearer to the monitors, but the feeds were still breaking apart with static and blowing snow. Even so, every now and then, one of the screens caught movement near the perimeter, something fast crossing the white before the image tore again. Another burst followed, longer this time. Then something hit the outer wall hard, and after that the sound from that side stopped. Ruiz kept listening. "They're clearing the area," he said. No one answered. We just stood there waiting while the firing shifted position outside, moving in short intervals as if tracking things across the surface around us. It went on for less time than it felt like, then stopped all at once. The wind filled the silence immediately. A few seconds later, the radio came through. "Delta, area is secure. Prepare for extraction." Harris looked at us once. "Move." He released the door lock and pulled it open. The cold hit hard enough to make the whole station feel warm behind us. Outside, the aircraft were holding just above the surface through the thinning haze, their wash kicking loose snow across the ice. Searchlights moved across the perimeter and the broken ground beyond. Near the outer edge of the site, two of the creatures lay motionless where the gunfire had brought them down. Up close, their size was worse than it had looked on the screens. We didn't stop to look. Armed personnel were already moving around the station, watching the open ice instead of us. One of them signaled us forward, and we ran for the aircraft while the others kept their weapons trained outward. Hands reached down and pulled us in one by one. The moment the last of us cleared the door, it shut behind us, and the aircraft lifted immediately. The ground dropped away fast. From above, the site opened up in a way it never had from the surface. The collapse spread much wider than it had seemed on foot. A broad, broken section in the ice with fractured edges running outward from the center. And around it, there was movement. Far more than we had seen from the station. They were crossing the ice in different directions, spreading out from the collapse in long, fast lines. Some stayed near the opening, but many had already moved well beyond it. From the air, it became obvious that they were not circling one place or staying near where they had emerged. They were moving outward. Further off, larger shapes moved among them. There weren't many, but there were enough. Ruiz leaned toward the window and kept looking down for several seconds before he spoke. "They aren't staying here," he said. Nobody answered him. The aircraft kept climbing and carrying us away, but even as the distance grew, the scale of it stayed clear. The station disappeared first, then the damaged rig. Then the collapse itself became just another dark break in the white. The movement remained visible longer than any of it. Far ahead, the edge of the continent stretched toward open water. I stayed at the window as long as I could, watching the ice fall away beneath us and thinking about Becker still out there, the broken ground below, and everything that had come out of it. By then, one thing was already clear. We had not escaped the end of something. We had only made it away from the place where it began.